So good morning, and thank you all for joining us on this session for CRMS and Alice. And I will pass this over to our presenters.
Good morning. My name is Laura Parker, and I am a clinical contracting team manager in the Office of Sponsored Programs, and I am here with Sandy.
Yes, good morning. I'm Sandy Barnhart, and I am a Senior Research Administration Manager with the Institute for Global Health and Infectious Disease.
So this morning we are going to give you a presentation on navigating contract submission using CRMS and Alice. Go ahead. So first, which system do you use, Alice versus CRMS? And there is just a small chart on this slide and the next that kind of gives you a brief overview of which agreements go through which system. Some start in CRMS and flow over to Alice. But if you need more detail, that chart in expanded version could be found on the industry contracting webpage, and that link will be on one of the later slides. But just to give you a broad overview, CDAs for clinical purposes go through CRMS, and for non-clinical purposes would go through Alice. And then for clinical trial agreements, also known as CTAs, investigator-initiated trial agreements, and any applicable outgoing subcontracts that might be needed off of those investigator-initiated trial agreements would go starting in CRMS and moving over into Alice. Task orders under master clinical trial agreements, any incoming clinical subcontracts, those would both go through CRMS. And then any CTA amendments that might be needed off of active clinical trial agreements can be started either in CRMS or Alice. So some other agreements, we have collaboration agreements and other agreements without funding. And then DUAs, the only DUAs that are used or moved over into our system through Alice are DUAs that do not fall in one of the categories below. So those, again, would go through different systems, and more details about that could be found on the large table that's on the industry contracting webpage. And then material transfer agreements, those only MTAs for materials that would be used in humans in a clinical trial or for which PHI is being exchanged would go through Alice. And just to mention, a lot of MTAs and some CDAs would be initiated through the Office of Technology Commercialization. So that would go through that office and rather than OSP. So I just wanted to give everyone a broad overview of the agreements that I've mentioned that are submitted in CRMS and Alice. Starting with a confidential disclosure agreement or a CDA. So this is just a contractual agreement which outlines the terms under which confidential information would be exchanged. And these are pretty much required anytime the university would be looking to partner with an external collaborator for something like a clinical trial or a sponsored research agreement. And it's really just meant to protect the parties' confidential information that might be disclosed. Clinical trial agreements, this is a legally binding contract between an external sponsor and the university, which outlines each party's responsibilities and obligations for the clinical trial. They are required for both sponsor-initiated protocols and investigator-initiated protocols. You have collaboration agreements, and these are used to outline the research obligations from both parties in the pursuit of a common research objective. And so in these agreements, there isn't typically funding involved. Each party is responsible for their own cost to do the collaboration. Data use agreements, or DUAs, are contractual agreements used to define how access to and or exchange data may be used. And so DUAs are typically required when you're transferring human subject data that includes at least one of the 18 HIPAA identifiers, and that could be incoming or outgoing. And usually if there's no other agreement that governs the transfer and use. So if you have an underlying research agreement that already addresses that data transfer, like a clinical trial agreement, you won't typically need a separate data use agreement. Then you have material transfer agreements. And again, these are agreements which govern the transfer of tangible material between two entities when the recipient intends to use it for its own research purposes. So anytime the university wants to send or receive tangible material such as reagents, cell lines, plasmids, other things, mice, for research purposes, we would need an MTA in place. And these typically don't have funding associated unless it was for just the simple shipping of the material. If funded, MTAs are a little bit different. So now I'm going to turn this over to Sandy to give y'all an overview of how you actually would submit one of these contracts through CRMS and Alice.
Thank you, Laura. So for the purposes of this presentation, this is a very high level walkthrough, and we're assuming a clinical trial, but I just want to give a plug. The Network for Research Professionals will be doing a deeper dive on different types of contracts in our February session. So if you haven't subscribed to that, please subscribe to our listserv and be on the lookout for that. But for right now, we're just going to go through a clinical trial agreement. So all clinical trials start in CRMS. And the very first thing that you have to do is create a new study. And in order to create the new study, there are a ton of tabs in here, but we only have to focus on a couple here. We're going to enter a PI name, the estimated time frame for the entire study, and a short study name, which will show up as your identifier in CRMS. Then when you go in, you want to click on Submissions, and then go to the Office of Industry Contracting sub-tab. If you already have a CDA on file, then you would submit clinical trials agreement request form. If you don't have a CDA on file, you start by submitting the CDA request form, and all of that gets moved over to Laura's team from there. And once you have that added, then it will take you into Alice. It should automatically bring you into Alice. And there are a number of questions that you have to fill out in order to create the record before it can be assigned to a contracting manager. So the first thing that you want to select is the agreement type. And as you can see here, there are a number of different kinds of agreements. And depending on what you select for a clinical trial agreement or CDA, you'll have different options here. But just for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to go with a basic CDA. And they want to know the funding info. So they're going to ask if it's sponsored by an outside entity. Or if they will be providing materials, devices, or supplies. So generally, we say yes when we're putting something into Alice. For question 3, you put in the sponsor name. This would be the sponsor that is named in the clinical trials agreement document. Sometimes that shows up as the CRO, and sometimes that shows up as the actual pharmaceutical sponsor. And then for question 4, this is very important for personnel. There's a certain order that you have to enter the information. You start with the lead PI, then you put the sponsor contact, and then you add a department contact. Those are the 3 required spots, and then you can add any applicable study staff in addition to that, your budget negotiator, your coordinators, etc. And once you're in there, you have to put in the study administering department. This may or may not be the PI's home department, like an IGHID. We do clinical trials for people from all kinds of departments, but we always default to our project or our department code. And then for question 6, you want to put in the PI's contact information. What is their physical address, their phone number, their fax, and their email? Question 7 is where the payment information would go for the clinical trial. So that might be the Office of Sponsored Programs, or it might be the department. For us, we send it, we have the checks come to our department directly. And there are a number of questions about the study itself. Will it involve human subjects? If you're using this system, most likely the answer to that is yes. Are you using an outside IRB? So are you using the local IRB, or are you using a central IRB? And if you are using a central IRB, you would have to select them from the list. They will ask if you have an IRB number. So if you have already submitted it to UNC's IRB, you may or may not have a number. If you don't, you have the information, you should provide when you expect to submit it to the IRB. And then you want to add in the full study title, which is what you would get off of the protocol itself. And if the sponsor has a protocol number, you would add the protocol number. And then again, if you have received the documents for the draft agreement and the protocol, you want to provide the date that you received those. Ideally, you want to get the CTA submitted pretty much immediately after receiving it so that you don't get any delays. And there is a question here, if you've received a study startup or site activation letter or agreement, some sites will get that in advance of the CTA. And if so, you should select yes and provide a copy of that as well. But for the purposes of this, I just selected no. Then they want the type of study. So if this is an FDA regulated study, it will indicate whether or not it's a different drug biologic phase study. It might be a device study, it might be an observational study, it might be a data registry. So you would just identify the type of study for that. The estimated length of the study, this is for the entire study. So this would be from first subject enrolled to last subject completed for the entire study. And it's important to do that because then you're not having to go in and constantly amend the end date in the system once you have it approved. And some sponsors will give you a clinicaltrials.gov number. And if they do give you that, you should provide that because that helps to get more information on the study itself. If you don't have it, you can just select no. Will the sponsor provide all of the funding? So some studies, a sponsor will only provide funding for certain things, and then other things will be considered standard of care. So they would be like the insurance's responsibility. For the purposes of this, we say yes. And then your study budget status. So you'll get a budget. Generally, you get a budget and the CTA draft at the same time. So you can select if you have not even started the negotiations, if it's under negotiation, or if you have a final budget ready. So that will let the contracting manager know where that stands. And if there's any additional industry sponsors, that's where you would add them in. Will there be any federal funds supporting the clinical trial? That would be yes or no. Some networks have multiple funding sources in their clinical trials. Will any materials be provided by someone? Will they be providing cells? Will they be providing equipment? Not the sponsor or the CRO. This would be a third party entity. And will outgoing subcontracts be required? That's if UNC is going to be the primary site and, like, for instance, Duke might be a subsite under us. That's when you would select yes for that. And more questions, there's all kinds of questions in here. Where will the majority of the study visits take place? Will it be at the hospital? Will it be at an outpatient clinic? Will it be at the CTRC? This is where you would put that information. And then again, some of these questions are a little redundant, but will this project involve human subjects? Most likely, yes. Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention if it's a clinical trial? Most likely, yes. Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on participants? Most likely, yes. And is the effect being evaluated is the effect evaluating a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? Most likely, yes. And I just want to point out, these are the same questions that the NIH uses to define a clinical trial as well. So they'll seem pretty familiar to you. And once you have those questions answered, you'll go to a PI certification screen, and you can skip the PI certification questions. That will go directly to your PI, but do not skip the attachments. And these are the attachments that are the minimum attachments that are required for the contracting manager to be able to start a billing coverage analysis, or BCA, or for the Office of Industry Contracting to get this assigned to a contract manager. And right now, the contact for that is Sandy Florence, and she would put those in. So you need to have, at a minimum, your draft CTA, your sponsor protocol, your draft or final budget, and a copy of the sponsor template informed consent. And once you have that filled in, you can proceed to submit. You just want to make sure that all of your green check box or your check marks are there, except for the PI certification questions, because again, that will go to the PI. But please note that until the PI certifies, the study will just sit there. So once you've submitted it, please let your PI know that it's there. And then also important to note, that once the study's been submitted to the Office of Sponsored Programs, it will be reviewed by a contract coordinator before being pulled in, just to make sure that everything is there. And if any of the requirements are missing, that can cause delays. And with that, I will give you back to Laura.
Thank you, Sandy. So yes, just to reiterate what Sandy already mentioned, I just wanted to touch on some common errors that OSP typically does see in these submissions and things that can cause delays in getting your contract review started. So again, all the required attachments must be uploaded in order for these to be pulled into our system and assigned to a contracting officer. So again, those attachments are the draft contract, the sponsor's protocol or scope of work, the budget, and then the sponsor's informed consent template. A lot of other things errors that we often see are if there's missing or incorrect information. So if the protocol number or the sponsor's name was missing or incorrect, and that information has to be validated and corrected. And again, the PI certification, as Sandy mentioned, it will not be, submitted and pulled into our queue if those pieces of information are missing. And so, though the contracting coordinator, Sandy, will have to come back to you and ask for this stuff in order for her to then pull it into our system to be assigned. So it is very important that all this information be included in these submissions when you are completing these submissions to OSP. Next slide, please. And so lastly, we just wanted to provide, again, the link to the industry contracting page and CRMS and Alice. As was mentioned this morning, the websites are being revamped. And so be looking for that to come out in, I believe, in the next few days or so. But that information will be in other sessions. And one other thing to mention, we talked about CRMS and Alice here, but there are other sessions in this symposium that touch on the other system that OSP uses, which is Ramsey's. So please check those other sessions out for more information on Ramsey's.
Yes, and I just want to add, once you have your final budget and you have your contract executed, you will want to enter that information into Ramsey's. That will be the last step that is needed to get the project ID in order to actually get funding for the study. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for your attendance. And with that, are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you, ladies. That was great. This is super informational. And we have one question. And from this person, they said, hi, this is a bit off topic, but I find that after completing these initial steps to start a new trial in CRMS, we have a lot of trouble preventing a duplicate CRMS record from being generated when the IRB application is submitted, even if both locations have the exact same information entered for the study title. Do you have any tips for that?
Yes. Actually, we have that issue in IGHID because our faculty are housed in different departments. So the IRB will ask for the faculty, the PI department, and if the department number isn't the same as what the research administration department is, it will create duplicate records. And then we have to contact Laura or Sandy to have the records merged. And Laura, I don't know if you have any additional advice about that.
No, that sounds good, Sandy. Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. And we actually do have one more question, which is, would DUA submissions follow a similar path as the CTA submission? What is the timeline for DUA approval? So
yes, what Sandy outlined in the screenshots, all of the submissions for CRMS and Alice are very similar. You'll fill out the information that's applicable depending on the type of contract that you have. Timeline for, all of these contracts to be reviewed and approved can vary depending on the flexibility of the other party you're dealing with. Again, whether, how long it takes to ensure that the submission itself has been accurately completed with all the information that's required for us to start that initial review. And then, of course, like volume and workload of the contracting officers themselves.
And I would just add to that, if a DUA is tied to a clinical trial, I believe you have to enter the DUA directly into Alice. I don't think you go in through CRMS to add a DUA, but it will ask you, like, are you working with a study? Do you have an IRB number? Do you have a project ID? And that's where you would put that in, and then they would link it that way.
Excellent. Thank you, ladies. And I think with that, we actually don't have any more questions, but thank you all for attending. And obviously, a big thank you to our presenters.